Well, the clock has officially struck, so we are going to begin. This is The Value of Being Curious, a conversation with co-founding partner at Floodgate, Mike Maples Jr. We will cover his best-selling book and the idea that I saw embedded deeply in it, which is that lifelong learning and curiosity are what drive innovation and allow us to see the future. My name is Seth Green, and on an afternoon like this one, I'm especially grateful to say I'm the Dean of the Graham School at the University of Chicago, and I welcome you to our gorgeous campus, which is this green and beautiful today. And the weather we have may actually compete today with the Bay Area, Mike. So this is a rare moment where you may have wanted to be with us in person rather than out there on the Bay. Alas, the virtual world has its benefits and convenience. We are thrilled, for those of you who are not familiar, to welcome you to our Graham School. We are the home of lifelong learning at the University of Chicago, and we have been in this mission for 134 years because we are one of the three founding divisions of the university, because of a belief of William Rainey Harper, the founding president, that the learning and ideas should not be just within our walls, but should extend well beyond. And we were the first extension of our type in higher education and continue to this day to hold the mantle that our role is to extend the intellectual assets for life enrichment for all learners. And we are very grateful to so many of you for being part of that mission. Speaking of that mission, I'll just briefly acknowledge, because we start our autumn quarter next week, that this is a very exciting time at Graham. We are welcoming in the next few days our inaugural, our second cohort, class of 2025 for the Leadership and Society Initiative, a group selected from more than 350 candidacies around the world. We are welcoming our largest group of incoming autumn students in more than a decade for our Master of Liberal Arts. And we are also on track, although there's still a few more days to register, to have our largest cohort for the basic program of liberal education for adults since the 1950s. And a few more days for those who want to join this bumper crop cohort, because you can too be part of an extraordinary great books tradition, and we'll put in the chat information on that front. I'll just share in closing, before I introduce our speaker, that we have a lot of other exciting events coming up, and you can see them on your screen, and you'll be able to sign up in the chat for those as well. And then we still have 3 more days before we close our autumn course registration. And on the screen are just a few of the exciting options from more than 70 across our catalog. All right, the reason that you are here is because you want to learn from Mike Maples Jr. And let me take down my screen now, introduce him, and we can talk about the exciting book that he's written and the ideas that he has. So welcome, Mike. Mike is a co-founding partner at Floodgate. He has been on the Forbes Midas list 8 times in the last decade. That is a remarkable outcome because it's a very competitive list, and that means 8 out of 10 times in the last decade he has been on it. And he is also a rising star by Fortune, profiled by Harvard Business School. What I took away, which you'll hear in a moment, is that he looks at this not just as someone who is in business, but really as a curious person who is constantly trying to learn about the world and making decisions in that context. And so someone that is very close to our heart at the Graham School. To get us started, like, I want to, kind of paint a little bit of a picture of who you are as a lifelong learner. Then we'll come to your book, and then I'd love to go into the value of being curious as you've outlined it in the book in so many ways. So let's start with you. I read a little bit of your formal biography, but could you offer us background about you as a learner, how curiosity has been central to your life from what I know is very young, and how it continues to show up in your daily life today?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me, and hopefully I can offer something to this group of people. It's definitely a distinguished group, so hopefully I can lend some perspective. So I'm not really sure what drove the curiosity. My dad was always very curious. He would, back in the day when you had physical magazines, he'd get all these magazines and probably subscribed over 50 of them. And so there would always be this giant pile of magazines all the time. And in his office, it would just look like almost like a paper bomb had hit it. There was so much stuff. And he was reading all the time, and he'd come home from work and he'd be reading his, usually trade journals, PC Magazine or Computer World, or, some of these magazines that existed at the time. He had much of an ethos about reading, but then my mom was really supportive. I got really interested in dinosaurs when I was, in grade school, and I'd read that the best example of a Tyrannosaurus Rex skeleton was at the Museum of Natural History, and so my mom would take me to the one in New York because we lived in New Jersey at the time, and then I'd say no, but the better one is in Washington D.C. And so then we'd find some way to go down to Washington D.C. And so my mom wanted to make sure that like any opportunity I had to go see the best example of whatever dinosaur I was interested in, we would go. Then it was sharks, and then it was whatever. So it was always kind of that way. I think more to the point for today, like I've learned a couple of things that I think might be valuable to people. The first is what I like to call like the T of learning, which is like you have this breadth and you also have a depth at the same time. And so in the breadth, I've gotten really interested in the 10 branches of knowledge. And, just to kind of go through them really quickly: philosophy, math, physics, statistics, engineering, chemistry, biology, psychology, economics, history. And in those areas, I just try to have a passable working knowledge of what the best thinkers in history have thought. I think if you're interested in philosophy, it's good to know who the most important philosophers are in history and what were their big ideas that were sort of lindy. And then at the vertical slice, I think you want to pick an area where you want to be like a train spotter, where you're like super deep and interested, and you're trying to develop specific knowledge beyond what anybody's ever developed before. And I learned this watching Buffett and Munger and how they invested. They would read every annual report of every Fortune 500 company, and they would just go super deep and specific into their own sort of it's their own discipline. And so I think there's value in doing both. If you go horizontal and wide, you get a lot of worldly wisdom. If you go very vertical and deep, you can show up in the world in a very differentiated way within your specific niche and field.
When you told me, Mike, about your diet for reading right now, and it's a very significant appetite, do you want to just share, like in your daily life today, the extent to which you are reading beyond just your domain expertise?
Yeah, I like to, if I can, get in at least 20 hours a week of reading. And if I can do more, I will, like if there's holiday breaks or stuff. And so I try to divide it between the horizontal stuff and the vertical stuff. And I look at it like it's an information diet. So you're just like, if you're thinking about your nutritional diet, what's the optimal mix of protein and carbs and stuff like that, or what's the if you if you're exercising, what's the optimal mix of cardio and weights, and how much time you're going to spend, and what do you get for that time. I think everybody should have an information diet, and it's almost like you have this queue of things to read, and you try to read the most valuable next thing to get to in the given unit of time that you have, whether it's horizontal or vertical. The other thing I've been doing a lot of that I would encourage people to consider is integrating that with Chat GPT. And so now when I read, I have Chat GPT open or Claude, and you can do a lot of very interesting things. So I'll give you just a quick example. Like I have a list that I've gathered over many years of 100-bagger startups. And Chat GPT won't tell you what those are. You have to figure that out. And so a 100-bagger startup is one where you would have made 100 times your first check. So now that I have that list, I'll go into Chat GPT and I'll upload the document, and I'll say, please consider this document of 100-bagger startups. And then here's a document of 10 value propositions for why people buy from startups. Can you tell me, of these 10 value propositions, what was the primary one for each of these 100-baggers? And what was the least important for each of these 100-baggers? And so what you want to do is you want to combine the specific knowledge that you've gathered that no robot could gather through your worldly wisdom and work. and you want to combine that with the cognitive labor capabilities of ChatGPT, and you can have it go explore a bunch of options at the edge that you'd have to hire an entire team of researchers to go explore. And so I've been playing with a lot of that stuff lately. I think it's, I wish I was younger again so that I could be early in my career and I'm doing that stuff, because I think it would give me huge leverage.
Well, we'll come back to the value of being curious later, but it does make you younger in a number of ways. So maybe that fountain of youth is around the corner, and certainly your reading diet will help you get there. Mike, let's jump into your book, because you've been an investor for a long time. You've been curious your entire life. You decided a couple of years ago you could take all of this knowledge and put it into a book where you're really distilling what you've learned about what makes these startups that you've invested so successfully in successful. And you have a thesis, which I think is intensely interesting, which is that what really allows them to be successful as pattern breakers is to eschew these best practices and see a world often outside of the traditional frameworks and essentially see the future before it's here, even amidst many people denying them that idea in their early days. Can you just give a snapshot of your book? And, maybe we'll call this enough to appetize and lay out the picture. And certainly people can go further by buying the book, but our aim for this conversation is kind of lay some of that out. And then we're going to dive specifically into the value of being curious that's embedded within this bigger thesis. But let's lay out the thesis first.
Yeah, so some books happen because the author is smart and they want to contribute their frameworks and expertise. And the genesis of this project was actually quite the opposite. I was noticing that a lot of the companies where we'd had success, I couldn't explain their success very well. So, Twitter had started out as a podcasting company called Odeo, and then it pivoted to TWTTR, and then they called themselves Twitter, and then they couldn't decide who the CEO was, and then they had the fail whale on the way to success. And then Lyft started out as Zimride, and it pivoted to Lyft, and then launched an illegal service that was successful. So we got the law changed, and then Twitch started as a terrible idea called Justin TV. And then at the same time, I was working with all these startups where they seemed to do all the right things. They'd had a good culture, they'd hired well, they'd implemented all the best practices that you're supposed to implement, and yet they still failed. And this wasn't just kind of a one-time occurrence. I saw this happen over and over again. And so I decided I either just needed to retire because this is a random business and, it's just like I've been fooled by randomness all along, or there was like something else worth understanding. And so I spent 3 or 4 years in this rabbit hole of understanding, well, why do some startups, rare startups, have these incredible breakthrough outcomes? And, is there something else to understand here? And that was kind of the genesis of the book. And the book came later. A professor that invited me to lecture at his class was like, we got to turn these ideas into something, because the students were starting to get very enthusiastic about some of the ideas that I was presenting to them. And so that, Peter Ziebelman really deserves the credit for this becoming a book.
Well, and if you can, give us like a few of the key lessons or takeaways from that book.
Yeah, so I think that the if I zoom way out, the main lesson that I learned is that business is never a fair fight. Eileen asked, "What's the name of the book?" So the book's named Pattern Breakers. So that the idea is that business is never a fair fight. The only question is who's going to fight unfair. And incumbent corporations operate by compounding their advantages. So they have economies of scale, network effects, and brand and process power and customers, supply chains, all this stuff, right? But what you realize is that a startup has nothing to compound. They don't have a product yet. They don't have customers. All they have is the founders and their idea. And so the default is that the incumbents are going to win because they have the advantage of the incumbency. So for a startup to win, it can't win by being better. It has to win by being radically different. It has to refuse the premise of the rules, and it has to harness a different set of powers to create an entirely different new set of rules that forces the incumbents to be disoriented and to react to the competitive strategy of the upstart. And so that's why I called it pattern breakers, right? Humans are conditioned to follow the patterns they always follow. They think tomorrow will be the same as yesterday, give or take. And what a startup needs to do is win not by just doing a better job of what exists. They need to win by changing the subject. So the way a startup capitalist creates value is fundamentally different from how a company creates value.
When they're great examples, I mean, so you think about Airbnb, they are competing with the hotel world. They're not building a better hotel. When you first think about this, they're basically saying, here, come take a bed in someone's random home. You know what I mean? Like, you say, oh yeah, that's going to be great at competing against the Four Seasons. And then they see, well, here's ways in which there's an advantage, or, Lyft. And you say, here, don't take this from a licensed cab driver that you can see is in this standard car that you can trust. Just get into someone random's car, so I think it's really interesting to kind of think about those ideas when they were starting, because today we now take them as conventional wisdom, that people would want to have this, opportunity to stay in someone else's home or get that car, to go as quickly as possible. But when you go back to the moment in which these people were imagining these ideas, they do, immediately sound far-fetched at the start. And you could see all the reasons why you would say, good luck with that. Come back when you decide to do something practical.
Yeah, that's right, Seth. And you kind of alluded to something that I think is really important in this, which is all the great startup ideas I've seen have this aspect of being non-consensus and right. And so,
Yeah.
and when you think about it, it makes sense. Human beings are conditioned to like things. And so if everybody likes the startup idea, that means it's too similar to the pattern of what they're already used to, which means that it's too similar to what's already known and what's already offered by the incumbents. And so what a startup needs to do is it needs to offer something radically different. And it's off-putting to most people at first, or it seems stupid or crazy or like inconceivable. But there's some subset of people who are like, oh my gosh, where have you been all my life? And it has to be that way by definition, because only by being radically different can you make a radical difference. And so you have to be non-consensus in the early innings. And after you win, it seems obvious, but in the early innings, it seems quite the opposite of obvious. It seems kind of crazy to most people, but that comes with the territory, right? That's part of the path to success.
Well, so Mike, this, but I'll share a probably well-known secret within this virtual room, that my interest in your book is not actually from a business perspective, even though that is intensely interesting in its own right. We have another school here that focuses on the business side. What my interest when I read it is what this means for education. Because your book basically tells the story of why we need people to be second order thinkers, meaning that they are able to really think in ways that are not preconceived, right? Not just based on, here's the 3-step process or here's the Six Sigma, right? We need them to be able to kind of think beyond the world that exists. We also want lateral thinkers rather than just linear thinkers, right? So you make a very strong case for the value in part of our economy, at the least, to be able to have this type of nonlinear creative thought that really allows you to envision and engage the future that doesn't yet exist. And so where I sit, what is very interesting is, what is the role of liberal education in helping people to potentially be in this kind of second order thinking and to be able to think disruptively. And so I'm curious to hear from you. What do you see as the key attributes that people need in order to be pattern breakers? And then what do you think that means for education?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think that there are areas where formal education, I think, can have a big impact, and there are areas I think that we need to be wary of formal education. You still need to
Yep.
get it, but recognize that it has limitations also, and we need to work around those limits. And so the place where I think it can have a huge impact relates to what I was getting at earlier, kind of like this T of knowledge. So if you study creativity as a discipline, what most people would suggest is that creativity and breakthroughs come from forming new connections. So
Yeah.
there's different elements think of them as dots. And, you're connecting the dots in a new way. So the current pattern is a certain connection of certain dots. And then what a creative person does is they either collect new and better dots, or they connect existing dots in a new way, or they connect new dots and existing dots in a new way, but they form a new connection. And if you have worldly wisdom, if you're broadly aware of all those like 10 areas that I described, and you're also really deep in a certain area, you're going to create connections that other people don't create, because you're just going to have a broader available set of ideas that relate to each other and how they might relate. And so I think that formal education can play a huge role in that. And that's why I think it's risky to get too specialized, when you're getting a formal education. But I think that the part that's tricky with formal education is that, to some level, most of it does have a right answer, right? Like if
Right.
you're in a class, you write an essay, it gets graded, even if it's liberal arts. If you're in a math class, there's an answer to the math problem. And it's been, so the problem with that is that any question that has a predefined answer has already been discovered and is therefore not a breakthrough. It's understanding what's already been discovered. So there has to be a recipe, there has to be a playbook, there has to be a method to getting to that answer. And that's one of the things that school can be challenged, I think, because like the great creative breakthroughs come from assuming that the answer hasn't been determined yet, and that I have to pursue a bunch of lateral thoughts. You talk about lateral thinking. You don't want to think literally about what's the right answer that's been predetermined. You want to laterally pursue other things that are likely to be wrong, but that sort of add to the solution set of how you could think about something. And so you want to, I think, practice the discipline of being the type of person who explores new connections, outside of there always having to be a right answer that can be graded somehow.
Well, I just want to say that I really agree, and I'm proud to be at a school where we are in classrooms where generally, there are a couple exceptions in our graduate degree programs, there are no right answers and there are actually no grades, because people are doing it truly for life enrichment and for learning. So agree entirely with that vision, and I'm very proud to be a place where we are beyond those right answers. I'm going to add a spotlight now to one other person who's here with us, Alec Wang. Alec is the reason that we are having this conversation with Mike, because they are friends out in the Bay Area. And Alec is actually a graduate of the basic program. And the way that we got into this discussion with Mike is that Alec and I were talking about how his liberal education in the basic program, where there are no grades and no right answers, but there is deep discovery and creativity, was shaping his own experience as a leader. Alec is a very successful business leader. He's the founder and president of Tana Investment Group, which specializes in equity and debt investments within the real estate industry. And he is a proud graduate. And I wanted him to just share a few remarks about how his experience reading great books in this deep way with others has shaped him as a person and as a professional. And then we're going to come back after this to your questions for Mike. So please start filling the chat with them as you have them. Alec, can I turn it over to you?
Yes, thank you so much, Dean Seth, for the very kind introduction. It's always great pleasure to hear Mike speak. Now, I'm honored to share some thoughts in front of the two groups of people that feel like family to me. One is the intellectual community of the University of Chicago. The other is the Silicon Valley business and investment community, of course, represented by Mike. Although these may sound like very different worlds, they're in fact very interconnected. And as both a lifelong learner and an entrepreneur, I can, like you said, clearly see how the studying of humanities has enriched my roles in business and nonprofit work and personal life in different ways. For example, in business and leadership are not exact sciences. They involve navigating human complexities, understanding different perspectives, balancing competing interests, and definitely all the time making decisions with uncertainties. And a human-centered approach to business and capitalism, since we're in business, is what I aim to follow. And that is only possible by being better informed by the insights of the humanities. Another very relevant topic is how we engage with technology nowadays. In our very rapidly evolving tech-driven world, we have to remember that the tools we create are meant to serve us, not to control us. So it's very important that we set goals based on human values rather than being dominated by the conveniences and immediate rewards some technologies offer while suffering in other aspects. So I believe liberal arts education is one of the keys to achieving this balance. Additionally, I mean, I have always enjoyed building deep, meaningful relationships and empowering others through work, through nonprofit or personal circles. While most of these efforts are not related to financial returns, they consistently give me the type of values and satisfactions that make them the greatest rewards to receive. And last but definitely not the least, I can see how liberal education has given me a broader perspective, better understanding, and even a richer pool of stories to draw from while I interact with my young children. And whether they're facing challenges or coming up with new ideas, I feel like I can help them better explore the world in thoughtful ways. So to tie all of these back to our conversation, I believe Mike embodies the value we've been discussing, the combination of curiosity, intellectual pursuit, and humanistic values while being an investor. He applies these principles well while leading, obviously, very successful, very impactful businesses. And that is a living proof of how successful business activity and entrepreneurship go hand in hand with thoughtful humanistic values in business. So that's also the origin why I thought this conversation might be relevant and helpful to our communities. So that being said, I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts, and I'll turn the stage back to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Alec. That was beautiful. And it really is at the heart of what we believe is our mission at the school in terms of really harnessing the power of humanistic inquiry to make individuals better people and better professionals. And so just immense gratitude. I do want to say that I think to come back to your ideas and then what you mentioned, Mike, about asking the right questions to ChatGPT. I mean, we live in a world where technical expertise is increasingly automated and available, right? And so I think this foundational ability to ask the right questions, which has always been important, it becomes even more important in a world where there is artificial ability now to answer a lot of those data questions. But the challenge is being able to figure out what is the right question and how do you build that curiosity to be able to investigate. We have many questions that are lighting up the chat for you, Mike. So let me start with Ellen's question. What are some of the books you're currently reading?
Yeah, so let's see, some of the ones that have been The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt,
Yeah.
I think is kind of interesting. There's a book called Deep Human Connection by Stephen Cope that I've found interesting lately. I'm not getting through it as fast as I should. There's another one called The Body Keeps the Score. And so I've been really intrigued lately by meditation techniques that let you go back to times that you experienced some type of trauma that you may have repressed and not even remember anymore, and release that memory and kind of release it from your system. Keys to Drawing by Bert Dodson. And so one of the things I've learned about startups is it's a lot like how artists draw. You start out by drawing with a really light pencil, and you draw ovals and circles and lines and squares and rectangles and stuff. And you're not attached to having the drawing being right because you're drawing so light that you could just change it and modify it. And over time, you resolve the drawing by drawing with darker pencils and with more force until you get the final drawing. It looks very complete. And to me, that's a good metaphor for a lot of things in life, right? You start out by not being attached to having the right answer. You explore the edges of it. You make the cost of failure really low, so you're not attached to success right away, and you escalate your commitments as you increase your certainty that you're right about things. And then another one has been Chase, Chance, and Creativity by James Austin. Kind of rereading that one. There's another one, I forget the name of the author. I think it's Arthur Brooks, maybe, From Strength to Strength.
Yeah.
I've been liking that one a lot. And then the other one I returned back to time and again is The Beginning of Infinity by David Deutsch. But I mean, there's just so many, right? There's so many good books.
And part of how you choose, Mike, is, you want that tea, right? So you want that breath. I have a question though, which is, I'm just thinking about myself here, but it may reflect others. There are certain subjects that I find more joy in than others, even though I believe in the value of all, right? So, I don't know that I'd be on a beach reading engineering or biology, but I'd certainly take history or philosophy there. Like, how do you think about that diet? Is it partly something that like a diet, you kind of force yourself to align to? Is it something that you're just really finding, books that bring you joy in each of these areas? I mean, maybe just talk us through a little bit about how you approach the broadness, assuming that you too maybe don't find equal curiosity in all of these areas.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I'm probably better in my information diet than my regular diet or exercise. But like, what people tell me is that if you want to get in good physical shape, the trick is not what's the right exercise. The trick is the one that you're really going to do. That's not going to feel like too much of a onerous leap. So like I have a friend, right, who what he does is he just does, if a meeting ends and he's got time in his next meeting, he's working from home, he just does push-ups. And he tries to get 200 push-ups in a day. And, that's his way of getting the exercise in, because it's the thing he's willing to do without fail. And so I look at it kind of that way. Maybe I don't like biology as much as I like art, for example. But I'm like, okay, well, what is a biology book that I'd be willing to read, that it wouldn't feel like too much of a heavy lift, and I'm just there's got to be something out there, right, that would be exciting. And so I try to find people in that field and try to understand what they think would be interesting. But it's I find that all these areas, if you're really legitimately curious, it's hard not to be interested. It's hard not to be interested on some level.
Millie Ray has a question. What advice do you have for a generalist who is very much at the T, and I think they're referring to the top of that, of learning, and making the case for their value when others want to work with people who have the right or correct answers? How do you think of that generalist value in a world that, I mean, increasingly in education, we see like a very focused effort toward professionalization. So if you were to compare curriculum today to a generation or two ago in universities, and this is higher ed net large, not the university in particular, we've moved from a place of liberal education to a place of much more focused and technical. And so I'm curious kind of how you think about that generalist value, and is there a way in which that maybe bends in another direction over time as technological advancement continues to change, automation of expertise?
Yeah. So the way I think about it is everybody in the world is like a node in a network, and everybody has a genetic code, and your strand of DNA and mine and everybody on this Zoom is unique and has never been duplicated in the history of humanity. So like on some level, everybody is unique. And if you follow the principles of like Ricardo and Adam Smith, they would say that means everybody has a comparative advantage or a set of comparative advantages. So I look at it like we all have an opportunity to show up in the world as our very best version of ourselves. And that it has to do with what we're intrinsically motivated by. That has to do with where we do have talents. That has to do with what we could do that the world finds valuable from us. And so what I try to do is engage in what Cal Newport would call deep work projects that actualize the things that I think I can bring. Because I think fundamentally, right, if you're doing deep work and it's a reflection of your talents and your intrinsic motivation, you're going to be hard to compete against because there's only one you. And so you're trying to, but what you don't want to do is spend all day checking email and all day answering phone calls, and because you have to do some of that stuff, right, just to be conscientious. but that's not differentiating, right? Like when you exercise in the morning, you're getting as much leverage on your time as Barack Obama does. So it can't be deep work. It's necessary, but not deep. So the deep work is things that you're doing that actualize your unique ability to show up in the world, that push you to struggle at the edge of your knowledge and capabilities, and allow you to show up in the world where there's only one you. And you know, people who value your advantage, you're going to be the only person that they can get that from. And so that's kind of what I look for primarily.
When I like to think of ourselves as Barack Obama, although even on fitness, I feel like he would be an incomparable role model somehow.
He'd kick my butt on that. Yeah, probably.
Basketball too, based on what I've seen. All right, Jerry has a question. Philosophers recognize that liberal education can't teach citizens how to recognize pattern breaking without a pattern for pattern breaking. Have you found any explicit statement along these lines in your research?
Yeah. So it's funny because the less kind version of that question would be, hey, isn't the idea of pattern breaking itself a pattern? And you know, so there's kind of this recursive question, right? You tried to find the pattern in what the breakthroughs were, and you said it's pattern breaking. Is that a sort of pattern? And I think it is and it isn't. So here's what I mean by that. Like, I actually think pattern matching, for the most part, is a good thing. Our minds are wired to spot patterns. You know, they're also wired, it turns out, to imitate others. And there are positive upsides to that. Like when a saber-toothed tiger roars, when we're cavemen, you want to run away from that saber-toothed tiger. You don't want to debate first principles of whether that thing's a threat or not. And like when we get up in the morning, brush our teeth, we don't have to have an existential discussion about what's the best way to clean your teeth. So patterns help us navigate the day. It reduces the cognitive load of living life and interacting with other people. But the problem is that pattern matching creates a bias over time, and you start to engage in a pattern without even realizing it. So you know, there's this one example that a study where they asked people to watch people in white shirts passing a basketball to each other, and then there's a bunch of people in black shirts, and they ask them to count how many times they pass the basketball. And a person in a gorilla suit walks into the middle of the frame for 9 seconds and jumps up and down and does jumping jacks, and only half of the people saw the gorilla. And so you think about that, that's just incredible to imagine that it's in the middle of the frame, like being as overt as it can. And so the problem that we have sometimes is that the pattern matching creates a bias that we don't even realize exists. And so what the great founders do, pattern breakers, is they're the outliers who realize that there's a better explanation for how things could be done. It may be uncomfortable at first, but they not only find that answer, but then they persuade a subset of us humans to follow them to that different future. And over time, as their heresy becomes the conventional wisdom, everybody just says, oh, well, that's how it was all along. And that's true not just in business, it's true in science. You know, when Copernicus said that the sun is the center of the solar system, not the earth, I mean, the Pope put him under house arrest. The Catholic Church didn't admit that it was true for 200 years. And so, you know, you get these situations where it seems like heresy at first. Euclidean geometry was that way. Einstein's general theory of relativity, a lot of people thought he was smoking weed when he proposed that, you know. And so, you know, you have this, every now and then you want somebody to introduce something radically new that defies the current pattern. And so, like, what I'm trying to suggest in the book is that you want some mix of both, that both are valuable. And if you do too much of one, you'll just get locked in a current state of play. But if all you do is break patterns, you won't compound the advantages of what's known and what's valuable and what's, you know, the work that's been done to build compounding advantage in the past.
When, to your point about seeing that gorilla, Mike, I mean, what you're really describing is building both capabilities. You want to sometimes be able to count how many times the ball moves, but you also want to be able to see in your peripheral vision all of these other possibilities. And that's where I think, by the way, that the way we approach liberal education is so important, because if we believe that there is a right answer always, we obviously are training the brain not to see that gorilla. And if sometimes there are right answers, right, because we've got to learn some facts and key insights, and then sometimes we're reading poetry and we interpret it 20 different ways across 20 students, it might train the brain in both directions and allow us to see patterns, but also see beyond them simultaneously.
Right. And you know, there are ways, the reason you want worldly wisdom, you know, to your point, is that you want to, one way to think about coming up with breakthrough ideas is to say, what's the path to a breakthrough? What's the steps? What's the formula? What's the recipe? And I'm arguing that that's wrong-headed, right? That there can't be a recipe for the undiscovered. Recipes only exist for things that have been discovered, where you can explain the discovered thing to other people. And so the way you come up with breakthroughs, it's a little bit Zen, but you become the type of person likely to encounter breakthroughs, right? Which means that you study in breadth, you become the type of person who notices things that other people don't notice. You know, you engage the world, you know, you don't let the days come at you. You come at the days mindfully and intentionally, looking for things that other people wouldn't notice because they're on autopilot. And so ironically, I think that the way to get breakthroughs is to become more the type of person that will be visited by the muse. And like the muse is knocking on the door all the time, waiting to visit us. But most of us aren't even aware of the fact that she's knocking on the door. Most of us are like worried about getting the next promotion or the next thing that we have to do to succeed in the dominance hierarchy of humanity. And you know, we don't take advantage of her visiting us all the time.
Well, so we are nearly at time, but I'm going to ask you this as a power round question because I want to get it, and it's a perfect ending. Jed Horowitz asks, what experiences and activities could a college student like myself seek out in terms of building a strong foundation for further learning and growth? So what do you share with Jed as he thinks about, you know, embracing the lifelong learning vision that you have, Mike?
So Jen, I think the way I would answer that question would be to say, what can I do that I can only do while I'm in school? So I'll give you an example. Like when I was in business school, I made a list of everybody I wanted to meet in business, and I would reach out to them. And I learned that when you're a student, you're just kind of more disarming. You know, like if I was a product manager at some random company, you know, John Doerr at Kleiner Perkins was less likely to meet with me. But if I say, hey, I'm a student at Harvard Business School and I'm trying to learn more about venture capital, tech startups and stuff like that, I found that somehow the innocence of me being a student would cause them to say, okay, I'll take that bait. Next time I'm in Boston, next time whatever, next time you're in California. And so then and then you want to make really good use of that time, right? You don't want to just ask questions to them that you could get on the internet. And so you want them to come away from that discussion thinking, oh, wow, that person is really interesting. You know, when I spend time with that person, I learned something that I hadn't learned before. Next time I want to talk about topic X, I'm going to reach out to that person. Because like, if I'm going to talk to John Doerr, right, his time is really valuable. And so he needs to feel like that wasn't just a mercy meeting, that you know, he got some, he's like, oh man, when I met that Mike Maples kid, he said some things I hadn't heard before. That was really interesting. Next time I'm focused on those topics, I'm going to reach out to him. And so like, that's kind of what you want to do. So like when you're in school, you have, I call it the free moves. And some of those free moves are perishable. You know, once you're no longer in school, you're perceived differently in the world. And so that's what I would do is I'd make a list of free moves that are perishable while you're a student. And I would take as many of them as you can, because once you're done, you're done. Then you got to find new types of free moves and whatever your next thing is. So, and there's other general principles, but to me, that's the high order bit is to figure out, you know, you always want to ask, what is the differentiating behavior that only you can engage in? And you know, what are the conditions around me that allow me to cheat and to, you know, to play by different rules and try things that other people can't try.
Well, Mike, this has been a phenomenal conversation. I'll acknowledge that one area I often don't read a lot in is these business how you do it books. And the reason is actually that I think a lot of them are oversimplified and not very real. And when you read them, they say like, lead boldly. And, and you say to yourself, like, there are lots of people that do that successfully. There are a lot of people that don't. Like, I don't really think that is the key insight. And I don't think it's that deep an insight. And reading your book was like the opposite end of the experience. It was like, here's all the data. Here are all the holes in this argument that I want to acknowledge out loud. And I think the reason you were able to accomplish that is because you are genuinely a deep thinker. And I think what's really exciting about this conversation and what's a role model, I think, for us is that you are bringing together multiple disciplines of knowledge. And so you're able to make connections that so many people don't see. And as someone who believes passionately in liberal education in its best form, which is not about right answers, but about the right questions, we really applaud what you're doing and are grateful for the time with you today. So thank you so much for your ideas and the conversation.
Well, thanks, Dean Seth. It was an honor to be included. And if there's folks in the group, I'm trying to reach out to more sort of big companies and more traditional organizations. And I've had some pretty interesting discussions with them about how to incorporate some of this thinking, what are the limits of the thinking. And so I'm always interested in getting people's thoughts on that kind of stuff. And so just mmjr@floodgate is my email. I'll just put it in the chat window, and would love to hear from people, and including calling BS on stuff, so that's that's an opportunity to learn as well, right? Getting validation isn't as you don't learn as much from that as learning something that surprises you.
Well, I'll just close with this example, Mike, because I think it's such a powerful idea. There is a managing director and former CEO of Morningstar who has been a graduate of our basic program like Alec, and he really valued how liberal education was shaping the way he would think more broadly. And so we actually have a partnership, thanks to him, where we bring liberal texts. I mean, these are, classical education texts of all different types into their workplace for conversations that are not related directly to work. And they've been doing this for years with us. And the aim is they just want to have people there that are thinking deeply and creatively, because they are a company that thrives on thinking differently than just what the best practice is in their case, the financial services industry. And so I just share that as one example. It's an outlier today, but maybe we're, engaging the future of what this will look like, because we see a potential breaking of a pattern, which is, professional development is just direct skills rather than this possibility of building these intangible assets for life. So we'll close without meaning to be shameless on my part with that example, because it just immediately rings true to what you're describing.
Absolutely. Cool. Well, thanks, Dean Seth. I appreciate the time. And Alec, thanks for connecting us all.
Thank you all for joining us. Thank you again, Mike. Have a great rest of the day to everyone and a great weekend. Bye.